All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. And I focus on great theories of everything, learning more about them, taking deep dives into them to show you how you might be able to use these things in your own life, especially for your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, your formation of a new paradigm, your um, your formation of a holistic worldview. And today is our 11th day of reading a work called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? And it's about two obscure groups of black musicians, so-called jazz musicians in Chicago in the 50s and 1950s and 60s, including the Sun Ra Orchestra. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Chapter 3, The Struggle for Freedom in New York. So Sun Ra has kind of developed his band and his ideas to propagate through his band. But then in 1960, they left New York, stayed in Montreal left Chicago, stayed in Montreal for a little while, then ended up in New York. Their car broke down, and they settled in on the Lower East Side, and they stayed there for about 8 years, and maybe 7, 8 years. And so this chapter 3 is going to explain what was going on in New York, and then chapters 4, 5, and 6 will expound on that same kind of vibe in Chicago, and how kind of the Chicago thing ended up being a little bit more sustainable. Okay, the struggle for freedom in New York, introduction. When Sun Ra and his band arrived in New York in 1961, the established world of bebop jazz was undergoing a profound schism. To some, bebop, so hot and potent in the 1940s, was now cool under the restrictive demands of representation and repetition. Nightclub owners demanded that the musicians represent the club's interest in their music, whether that be danceable music, music to stimulate drinking, or music to accompany another act. Record companies demanded that music in repetition be readily packaged for consumption. Songs could not exceed a certain length, and they needed to follow certain formulaic rules. Concomitantly, some of the musicians had developed dependencies like heroin, which paralyzed their creativity. Addicted musicians still had the inspiration, but not the willingness to sacrifice in order to develop it, having more devotion to the substance. Moreover, just as some musicians had become addicted to drugs, some suffered from stylistic dependencies that stunted their evolution. By the late 1950s, a handful of musicians were drawing attention to this situation by pioneering a new controversial way of playing that rejected the hip and the cool worlds of bebop. Variously called free jazz, the new thing, the avant-garde, out jazz, and even noise, its musicians produced sounds that were liberating to some, but offensive to others. The jazz world has remained badly splintered ever since. Before it became a movement, there were a few isolated leaders who each broke a path and attracted followings. It can be said that Sun Ra was one of these leaders, but the orchestra was really a movement unto itself, especially when it swelled to over 24 members. Sun Ra's contribution to the New York movement will be dealt with in a later section, for he had a mostly underground, hidden effect on the movement. This chapter will highlight other leaders: Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, Albert Ayler, and John Coltrane, because their struggles set the tone for what happened in Chicago right about the same time. a little bit later. Okay, this section, number 2, is called Free Jazz. It is first necessary to understand the confusion about its name. Free jazz was probably the main term that was used, but its inversion, jazz free, better describes the ideal of the musicians to liberate their music from the assumptions of the institutional jazz world and from the word jazz. According to many of the musicians, the word jazz, and therefore the words free jazz, had already been represented and repeated to death. So a quick inversion to jazz-free, like sugar-free or tax-free, accurately defines the mood behind the movement, a conscious omission, to be free from all non-musicians who profit from the word jazz. For the jazz-free musician, the jazz subculture's static restrictions impinged upon their desire to grow, both as musicians and as people. They felt that since they had experienced firsthand the elements of black music in ritual, catharsis, and the elements of jazz in representation and repetition, they could eventually learn how to integrate the two understandings. No longer could the music be used as a leisure activity. Instead, it would be much more vital. Cecil Taylor called it music that must be heard in America. Section 3, the higher mission. The jazz-free musicians considered their situation crucial enough to mount a refusal, a conscientious objection to jazz. Their non-cooperation sought to do away with compromising conditions, with, to varying degrees, critical expectations, sharecropping record dates, nightclubs, chord changes, and the dependent hip lifestyle all at once. Grounding this surge was a search for a sustainable alternative approach to urban black music. The musicians were undergoing a shift in worldview, which, as Jackson Lears has shown, T.J. Jackson Lears, is aided by the ability to sustain ambivalence. The musicians were looking for the space and time needed to develop themselves and their music. On the other side, opposing the jazz-free revolution, were the institutions and their technologies, the club owner, the record company, the A&R man, and the critic. Work in bebop recording had in many cases degenerated into cliches and addictions. More than one record company was reputed to pay musicians in heroin, and addicted musicians were often short on original ideas and had to resort to pet phrases or cliches. Also included in the objectionable practices were the set length restrictions that club owners imposed to make the most out of their 1 drink per set minimum purchase rule. Record companies imposed time limits too for convenient packaging. Having witnessed or experienced such violations of their creativity, the new movement among New York jazz musicians recoiled to the fringes of an already underground jazz subculture. Ronald Rodano argues that, quote, we may think of the jazz avant-garde and the jazz mainstream as 2 subgroups interacting in the same community, one dominant, the other only tentatively affiliated, each with its own kinds of musicians, audiences, critics, and agencies, end quote. Isolated musical explorations introduced by Ornette Coleman and Cecil Taylor and followed by Albert Ayler and John Coltrane, moved jazz free outside the cult of bebop. There were many commonalities among the musicians, but commentators have attempted to study the music in terms of the notes. They have focused on stylistic differences, not realizing that what those musicians had in common was primarily metaphysical, not physical or technical. Jazz-free was a rejection of stylistic and physical dependencies in the musicians. It involved letting go of old worldviews and habits and creating a new alternative. Such adjustments were made painstakingly slowly. One musician recalls his struggles to practice with the new mindset. Quote, "I couldn't play it at first. 15 minutes here, 30 minutes there, and eventually all the time." In front of an audience, the barriers were even higher, especially if the audience was not open to adjusting its worldview. As the musicians themselves were slow to understand the music, so they expected listeners to be unaccustomed to the new sounds. Some, like Cecil Taylor, used ritualization to lower the barrier presented by the new music. By invoking a ritual practice, the musicians tried to convey to their audiences that something different was happening, something that required a higher amount of participation than a spectator event. Generally, the music frequently veered from the swinging rhythms of bop, but this was not to say that the music had no rhythm. The rhythm was just different. The musicians therefore encouraged audiences to adjust. To the keepers of established jazz, however, the new direction seemed mutinous. The jazz critic, the self-appointed standard bearer of the establishment, was the quintessential custodian of the word jazz. The jazz critic, often the employee of record companies, national jazz publications, or both, recontextualized the music in words for the benefit of consumers. Clinging to his words, the critic quite literally was the last person in the house to be invoked into ritual. When hearing the jazz-free musicians, the critic tended to misunderstand. He failed to hear the music because it was not jazz. It was therefore outside his zone of expertise. By refusing to participate fully, to go inside the music, reserving no words to evaluate or judge it, by refusing to abandon all notions of objectivity and of expertise, the critic remained deaf to the different rhythms and other new elements of the music. In this way, the critic had the last word, with a critic's thumbs down repeated in local or nationwide publications. Club owners and record companies were likely to lose faith in that musician. Record buyers, too, would often not buy a record without a critic's endorsement. There were so many records to choose from that a consumer's guide would have great influence. This situation naturally benefited the musicians who used cliches. In bebop, the codes imposed by critics were often merely static, focusing on the realm of style, allowing the musicians little room for acceptable movement or growth, and erecting a ceiling to the music's evolution. Critics in their trade journal columns used chord changes based on letters and words and other stylistic criteria to evaluate bop. Under the code of bebop, improvisation only could occur in one direction, one dimension, within the structure of chord changes. The chord changes gave listeners, especially critics, a verbal standard to assess the music. The facility and style with which the bebop soloists, the primary improvisers who were most free from the restrictions, were able to negotiate the changes became the touchstone for success for the jazz critics. So while appreciating bebop for its serious, sophisticated, and complex nature, the critics often imposed their own European classical music aesthetic, taste, words, harmony, style, and virtuosity onto an African-American form. Similarly, critics of jazz free stretched too far the limits of their expertise. Coming to a music they did not fully understand, they often felt compelled to criticize the music because that was their job, even though their words violated the creativity of the musicians. Instead of acknowledging that they could not really hear the music, they assumed that there was nothing to hear. The jazz-free movement then was in large part a movement away from such expectations imposed, quote, objectively in words by commentators. In retrospect, if critics had given the music the deference they required, the critics might have realized that jazz-free was not a purely prearranged action, but a spontaneous expression. A more accurate way to analyze jazz-free music is as an affirmation of the subcultural opposition of bebop, but also as a call for sacrifice and discipline amid a permissive subculture. Coleman, Taylor, Eiler, and Coltrane, and others made heroic contributions to culture through their willingness to endure suffering to prove the rightness of their cause to other musicians and eventually audience members. In the 1960s, jazz musicians set out to liberate their music from the culture of commentators, in the same way that bebop musicians set out to liberate their music from orchestral swing of the 1930s. Such a move required confidence to disbelieve the expert and the printed word, and to believe in their music and that they would somehow be able to survive without relying upon the endorsement of the critic. Individual musicians naturally had different musical ways of moving away from their dependence on jazz. Some musicians sought non-Western influences for their music. Some tried to play outside of the diatonic scale. Others tried to abandon the swinging rhythm that had made the music easy for audiences to relate to. Some tried all three. Still, there was enough common intent among the various musicians to produce a great deal of cohesion and continuity within the movement. This common ground distinguished jazz-free musicians from their predecessors and their contemporaries who were still firmly entrenched in the jazz establishment. Predictably, there were many examples of ambivalence among musicians who concurrently played bebop and jazz-free. Since spontaneous improvisation outside marketplace standards often characterized the jam session, many bop musicians were exposed to free playing in these after-hours events. Jam sessions were held in the clubs of musician-friendly owners or even vacant buildings. Sessions were analogous to the pickup game in basketball, as opposed to the official game. There were no referees, nor scorekeepers, no people with only superficial interest, understanding, or appreciation. It was only for musicians and a few purists. The session was most important to the musicians because it was a true test. It showed where they stood with their peers. The sessions were often competitive, but mostly friendly. For the younger musicians, sessions offered opportunities to prove themselves and to learn the ropes, down to the finest details. Musicians have discussed the importance of learning crucial but overlooked lessons, such as, quote, how to take the saxophone out of its case and put it around my neck at sessions. The institutions put restrictions on the musicians, but they could fulfill their desire for creative expression in the jam session. It helped to, quote, get the taste of commercial music out of my mouth, said one musician. Another swing musician recalled, quote, the idea of a jam session that then wasn't who could play better than somebody else. It was a matter of contributing something and experimentation. The jam session was less an outreach to the community and more an unspoken communal ritual exclusively for musicians. By the 1960s, many musicians played free at sessions. Only those musicians most committed to jazz free, however, self-consciously performed free in front of audiences. After a point, This was mostly a matter of confidence, and many ambivalent musicians just couldn't get outside the institutional constraints and get inside the music, especially under pressure. Trumpeter Freddie Hubbard exhibited these ambivalent qualities when he worked with Ornette Coleman on a recording date in 1960. Quote, "When he called me to do the recording session, I told him, 'Man, I can't really get into that bag, so I'd rather you get someone else.' I didn't want to make it at first, but it was a challenge. We rehearsed twice, and the music was really interesting, because that was the first time I had played songs without chord changes. We got it together on sound. It was based on sound and feeling. Certain rhythmic patterns we would hit at the same time. I would say that that was the most challenging date I ever made in my life. You would have to create ideas that you never created before. In other words, I couldn't depend on my old cliches. I had a headache for about 2 weeks trying to figure this stuff out. It came off pretty good, but I still felt I was kind of out of context on that date." Hubbard was one of a host of ambivalent musicians who dabbled in jazz free, and he showed that jazz free ultimately began with an individual quest for freedom from the structures previously installed into one's own mind. In addition to their mental constraints, musicians had to free themselves from the habits of their own bodies. Since the institutions of the jazz subculture had endowed musicians with certain benefits, in quotes, musicians had to be able to abstain from and reject these in order to really become jazz free. Therefore, a key solution for the musicians was to set up possibilities for them to get rid of addictions of mind and body. Bebop pianist Alan Tinney demonstrated how addictions could and did manifest upon the mind and body of a jazz musician. Because of the virtuosity necessary for playing bebop, the musicians were under intense pressure to perform at a high level, particularly in the jam session. Tinney's problem was not drugs, it was nerves. He complained that the pressure, quote, "got on my nerves so bad, you could drop a pin and I'd say, 'That's A.' I could tell you what key it was in. I was so sensitive and so keyed. I was actually put out of commission, down from 135 to 112 pounds, and literally destroying myself." Because of the importance bebop attached to chord changes, it was necessary for a musician to have memorized all the key signatures to facilitate changing keys at the drop of a dime. While such rigor led to exciting music, it could also have an adverse impact on the nervous system of the musician. Tinney's condition is even more notable because he consciously avoided the more notoriously debilitating aspects of addictive drugs and alcohol. But the occupational hazards of bebop virtuosity were dangerous too, because as the musician heard it, he would say it in his mind. In one jazz-free musician's words, their challenge was to listen with the ears of a black man, where there was no running commentary on the music, letting go of the voice of the programmed mind, and tuning into the nonverbal sounds of the universe, inner space, was the formula for the jazz-free musician. There was no verbal intermediary between the music and the body. It was necessary to conceive of the music in other than words, in rhythm, in shape, in color, in feeling. The striving for jazz-free, even in private, required personal discipline and a willingness to sustain ambivalence long enough to reject one worldview and adopt another. Okay, this section is called Black Saints of Jazz Free. Within this environment, listeners were ambivalent too. Early jazz free was supported initially by some critics as a curiosity or as interesting ideas with the potential for development. After the novelty wore off, however, several critics became defensive, declaring the music a threat to the entire jazz tradition. One critic wrote that if this music is, quote, to be a standard of excellence in jazz, then the work of Lester Young, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, Duke Ellington, and all the other jazzmen who have been accepted as important artists is to be thrown on the trash heap. In spite of the jazz-free musicians' sincere efforts to incorporate the tradition, as they saw it, into their music, critics frequently pan the music using epithets such as anti-jazz, and even calling the musicians charlatans and fakes. Jazz critics, jazz audience members, jazz club owners, jazz record company executives, and even mainstream jazz musicians all felt threatened by the jazz-free movement, often responding with antagonism. In the end, though, being hated was often the very element that unified the jazz-free movement. The musicians were alienated from the mainstream and alienated from the jazz subculture, but they became united in that alienation. This leads credence to the argument that jazz-free was a sacrifice, a belief in a higher mission that enabled its devotees to withstand the high level of hostility generated by their music. Because of their conscientious objection to jazz, particularly their willingness to suffer, the pioneers of the jazz-free movement can be understood as black saints, whose mission was to disseminate a new system of beliefs, religious, philosophical, educational, social, and political. Okay, this section is called Ornette Coleman. Okay. Ornette Coleman was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1930. From the beginning of his musical career, Coleman was an outsider. He had been criticized by his audiences and by his peers since his youngest days as a musician. After one performance early in his career, Coleman was severely beaten by an audience member who disliked his music, his long hair, and his unconventional dress. Throughout this period, as band leaders in jazz, blues, and even vaudeville fired him for his failure to adhere to musical standards, he struggled to make ends meet. Drifting to Los Angeles, Coleman began to work outside of music as a manual laborer. In California, many musicians already indoctrinated into modern jazz idiom treated Coleman with alienation, if not contempt. For example, they refused to play with him at jam sessions. Various witnesses have described repeated episodes of Coleman walking into a jam session, and in response, the established musicians would pack up their instruments and leave. In a creative transformation, Coleman inverted that alienation and used it to locate the small group of musicians who were interested in playing with him. Trumpeter Don Cherry, drummers Ed Blackwell and Billy Higgins, saxophonist Eric Dolphy, and bassist Charlie Hayden and Scott LaFaro, the latter two being white musicians. Over time, he demonstrated his mission to them. They practiced for long periods, and when they weren't practicing, they continued to think and talk about the music on a more abstract level. This group would often isolate themselves for long periods to develop group beliefs and a group discipline with each other. Only in this way, they felt, could they reach their ideal collective improvisation, where they were so in tune and trusted each other to the point that they could let go of all restraints and play their deepest, most expressive music. Without this intimate process of sharing with other musicians, Coleman's evolution might have been much slower. Still, Coleman's collaborators were few, and their music was confined to an underground following within the already small jazz subculture in Los Angeles. By 1958, Coleman's group came to the attention of John Lewis of the well-known modern jazz quartet. Lewis, a pioneer in his own right, recognized something important in Coleman's music and encouraged his record company, Atlantic, to record him. Atlantic recorded and released Something Else in 1958 and The Shape of Jazz to Come in 1959. And that second record, I was getting goosebumps just thinking about that album because it's so great. But we'll just move on here. After some positive, encouraging criticism in Downbeat, Coleman was offered a chance to play in New York at the legendary Five Spot Club in 1959. Leonard Bernstein was one of those in attendance who were captivated by the group's music. Others hated it. By 1960, Coleman's music had become a controversial topic with both critics and musicians in New York. But as Coleman and his group stretched more and more each day, and as the novelty wore off, the music moved too far into unfamiliar territory for the critics. In that year, Coleman assembled a double quartet and recorded for Atlantic Free Jazz, a collective improvisation, one spontaneous piece which filled both sides of the 37-minute LP. In defending their well-established worldview, some jazz critics ridiculed free jazz in print. Many of them ignored Coleman's level of conviction and criticized not only his music, but also his motives to the point of libel. For example, one Downbeat critic who had actually been sympathetic to some of Coleman's earlier efforts felt that the saxophonist had gone too far with free jazz. For this critic, the record was, quote, the logical end product of a bankrupt philosophy created by nihilists with a common goal, which was, quote, to destroy the music that gave them birth. Nevertheless, critics' words helped to solidify a movement. The fact that the establishment lashed out with hostility tended to unify jazz-free musicians. Words like philosophy and common goal, printed in Downbeat magazine, helped to give a focus to a feeling that was in the air. Still, the movement was not for the timid. Often the musicians had nothing but their own convictions to sustain them, having sacrificed whatever legitimacy, stability, and income that jazz provided. Okay, I'm going to come up about a paragraph short of finishing this section, but we'll start up tomorrow when we return. Thanks for tuning in today.